So I wanted to do a quick, I don't know if review is the right word, but maybe a brag about this new binding cutter that I got off of Etsy from a maker named Murat Ikiz. Now, I've probably butchered his name, so if I have, Murat, I'm sorry, but it was a beautiful tool. I've been looking for a Grammel or binding cutter for a while. I've owned quite a few over the years. I owned the Schneider Grammel, which was a pretty good tool. I've owned a couple of violin makers' Purfling Cutters. Here's the one that I still have left. And we're going to talk a little bit about the differences. Murat's Grammel came just beautifully done. The white curved piece here is bone. I think it's ox bone or something, and then it's African Blackwood. Like most Grammels, you loosen the nut here, and you can slide the bar for your depth of cut. You loosen this nut, and you can tighten or slide the cutter. It came nicely enough with two cutters, which is very cool. The cutter was already pretty sharp. It's angled and beveled. So, what is a binding cutter? When you're making guitars, you have a peripheral binding channel around the guitar. We're going to show that in a minute. And you typically will route the channel for the binding and or purfling strips. Traditionally, a lot of guitar makers used violin makers' purfling cutters, and the difference between a purfling cutter is it usually has two thin blades. You can see here very thin blades, curved at the end, angled and curved at the end, and they typically had a separator in between the two blades that you could, a spacer bar that you could space for the width of the purfling cut that you wanted in a violin. It's different than when a guitar maker does binding, but you can use it for sort of in the same way, but it's never quite as perfect for a guitar maker. But let's talk about marking and cutting, because essentially these are marking gauges. So let's go to a traditional old-fashioned marking gauge. This is a Mortise Gage, old-fashioned English Mortise Gage that I now have set up as a marking gauge. And it was simple. You put the fence up, you could change the fence to whatever, and then, but I always had a hard time with these because, I dug the point in and against the wood. And then I figured out, and I learned from others, that if you rotated the tool and took the cutter off the wood, and then you rotated it back to just touching the wood, suddenly it's a fairly easy thing to mark your line. So that's the technique I usually use. I take the cutter off the wood, I rotate it back till it's touching, and now I make my line. We also had Slitter Gauges. Here's a Slitter Gauge. Works the same. The difference is the knife point, and this has an angled, curved knife point similar to Murat's binding cutter. But this was set up more aggressively. It's got a more aggressive idea for the purpose of cutting thin veneers. You can mark it just like you can, and I do the same thing. I'm rotating it, touching, and now it digs in pretty deeply in this case. But it works very similarly. You adjust the fence here. With this, you adjust or tighten the blade, and you can cut. But you can cut, of course, along a straight line because your fence is straight. But in this case, we have two sides. We have a curved, and we have a straight flush side. Do the same thing. So I use it the same way. I just get to the point where I'm touching, and there we go. Let's take a moment and get an actual guitar top and show you on that. So you have to determine whether you're going to use this as a marking gauge or a cutting gauge. Marking gauge is simply marking your line around the perimeter of the guitar, and you're going to mark that line and then cut it with another tool, for example a Dremel or a router. If you're going to use it as a slitter gauge, kind of like your slitter gauge here, you're going to go around the perimeter a couple of times and you're going to hit the depth that you want to hit. Then you're going to do the same thing this way so that you get your depth in this direction as well. I've seen demonstrations in which people have been able to route the top of a guitar in a matter of minutes, which it's pretty amazing. You do the same thing on the back of the guitar, which is typically hardwood. So you might want to set up one of the blades that Murat gives you for softwood like spruce and the other blade for hardwood. The Purfling cutter for the violin maker has a couple of disadvantages. For one, it's only curved. You don't have a flat piece to it. So that's a little bit of a disadvantage. The blades are set up really for a thin cut, but they're set up beveled and angled or curved in a similar way. So they're usually good enough to function certainly as a marking gauge for your guitar top and back, but maybe they're not, depending on the tool, they're not strong enough a blade to really function as an actual cutting blade, if I'm making sense here. So typically if I were to use this kind of tool, I'd use it more like I'd use a marking gauge. So the function, my methodology again is the same here. I am going to get it to the point where it is touching and then I'm marking my line. Now, this piece of course is not refined, so I've just got a wavy line at this point. If it were a finished top on a guitar, it would be smooth, and I would be cutting a smooth, consistent channel around the perimeter. So I'm really looking forward to using this in the real world. It's a beautifully crafted tool, and I can't say enough about the quality of the work, and I expect it's going to cut plenty of guitars for me in the future.